welcome to this webinar organised by the JEB to present to you the report by Professor Howard Gospel on direct employment, a study of economic, business and social outcomes based on the electrical contracting sector. A report focused on issues of real importance to us all across the sector, I think. I'm Brendan Barber. My background, I worked in the TUC for many years, was General Secretary for 10 years, also served as chair of ACAS for 6 years. And this debate about how we strike the right balance between flexibility in the labour market and security and fairness has been a debate running for a very long time, and a debate of particular importance given the way the labour market operates in the construction sector. Now, joining us today, as well as Professor Gospel, are Andy Mitchell, the co-chair of the Construction Leadership Council, Gail Cartmail, Assistant General Secretary of Unite the Union, and this year's president of the TUC, and Steve Bratt, the CEO of the Electrical Contractors Association. Now, I sense that the launch of this report is very timely. Last week, we saw a senior official of the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Fergus Harridans, discuss that one of the government's particular objectives was to consider how it can encourage contractors to increase direct employment and cut reliance on self-employed workers. And he highlighted concerns about the need for investment in skills and the successful management of key issues like health and safety and well-being of the workforce, all of which he suggested were undermined and damaged by the level of more casual forms of employment and self-employment. Of course, we've also recently seen the government publish the Construction Playbook, highlighting how public projects need to lead the way, delivering faster, better and greener if we're to meet our net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And of course, in April, a little later this year, we're to see IR35, forgive me, come into operation, also intended to make self-employment less attractive and hopefully lead to the use of more direct employment. So this is a report being launched at a time when the issues it addresses are under very, very active consideration in terms of public policy. So let me first turn to Howard Gospel. Howard, Emeritus Professor at King's College London, has researched and written extensively on industrial relations and HR and management practices. And his report, published by the JIB, I think provides some rich material on the issues we need to consider around direct employment. So Howard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and thank you everyone for attending today. Let me say 2 points by way of definitions. First of all, electrical contracting is part of the broader construction industry. It is not, we're not talking about your local electrician who does your kitchen wiring. We're talking about electrical jobs on large industrial, commercial and transport sites. Direct employment is relatively easily defined in terms of having a contract of employment and being subject to PAYE, paying national insurance and having full employment rights. Non-direct employment is more complex. There is genuine self-employment. Think of independent sole trader contractors. There is false self-employment, dependent contractors who might work for a long time for a particular company and who are not small entrepreneurs. There is also in the sector a form of false employment via umbrella companies where individuals do indeed have a limited contract of employment, but who basically work on a 0 hours contract basis. The evidence for the report comes from a whole set of interviews across the sector and the examination of over 1,000 documents from the industry, government documents, and peer-reviewed academic research articles. Next slide. So the numbers now are around about in the sector, 50% plus electricians are not directly employed. This has risen progressively through from the 1980s, but very importantly, there are differences across the sector. So there is more non-direct in London and the Southeast on larger sites, but equally in London and the Southeast and on larger sites, there are some electrical contracting firms which do directly employ. So there are choices. The report also stresses that there is a significant difference between the UK and other countries. In the UK, much more non-direct employment is used. The report considers drivers. First of all, there's an argument in terms of individual preferences, that individuals like this form of working. There is some evidence for that, but overall, I suggest that is not the case. There is an argument that this is driven by intermediaries, such as the growth of facilitating employment agencies and umbrella companies. This, I argue, reflects deeper trends and is not a cause in itself. Deeper trends, in particular, the report stresses the role of employers and employers' preference for non-payroll working because of the tax advantages it gives them, and to some extent the flexibility advantages. Governments have undoubtedly, through action and inaction in terms of labour law and tax law, played a very significant role in allowing this form of working to develop. Next slide, please. So the report looks at 20-odd outcomes, and here I just pick up on a few. In terms of wages and benefits, individuals may in the short term gain from non-payroll working, but over a working year and certainly over a working lifetime, they lose out. They lose out also in terms of benefits such as sick pay, holiday pay, and pensions. The main advantages of this form of working in terms of wage costs go to the employer, who does not pay, in particular, national insurance contributions. Though flexibility is got through this form of working by companies, I argue that that is flexibility on the cheap. It is numerical flexibility, that ability to take on and lay off, and that does not feed through in terms of efficiency and productivity. Very importantly, the report looks at skills, and the argument there is that non-direct working, self-employment, these guys do not take on apprentices, and companies using this form of labor do not take on apprentices. And this has a negative effect on future skill supply in the industry. It also has a negative effect on continuing training and upskilling and upgrading of existing staff and career progression. Next slide, please. I looked also at health and safety outcomes and concluded from looking at quite an extensive UK and overseas literature that non-direct working has a negative effect on health and safety and also on individual well-being. I was asked to consider building quality outcomes, building safety and quality outcomes. And here there is some evidence from government reports. There is evidence post the Grenfell inquiry. And I found a particularly useful industry report raising the bar, which suggested that this sort of procurement, long supply chains and transient labor at the end of it has a negative effect on building quality outcomes. So overall, the conclusion is that direct working, employment positive effects predominate for individuals, for employers in the longer term, for the industry, for the construction industry, and for broader society. Final slide, please. The report very much though stresses that there is a role for non-direct employment in a sector such as this, but only for genuine production reasons, that should not be driven by the vagaries of the tax system, and the arrangement should be transparent and based on informed choices by individuals. So individuals and firms. So for the parties, I have suggestions to the employers and unions in terms of modernizing agreements, and for others, for clients, for tier one builders, building firms, and for the government, there are recommendations as to ways forward. I will conclude at this point, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Howard. A brief presentation on a report that contains a great deal of very, very rich material, which hopefully everybody has been able to access. The sound there with Howard was problematic, I know, for quite a number of colleagues. Let's see if hopefully with other speakers, perhaps we may not get quite that level of interference. Our next speaker, just to give his reactions to the report and the issues it highlights, is Andy. Andy, delighted to welcome you. Andy's co-chair of the Construction Leadership Council, CEO of Tideway, a long and very interesting career in the industry internationally and here at home, Network Rail and Crossrail, for example, huge projects. Andy, be very, very interested in your reaction, and let's keep our fingers crossed that the sound doesn't prove too troublesome.
Okay, thank you, Sir Brendan. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, and hopefully others can too.
Good, good. All right, well, thank you. Well, firstly, I'd like to welcome the report and congratulate Professor Gospel for the research and for articulating the issues and the arguments. I think that we'll all recognize. I think it's important to remember that it has taken decades for this industry to get to where we are. And some things are much better. I think you go back 20, 30 plus years and health, safety and well-being has come along a long way. And as we know, much more recently, mental health is being way better understood and addressed than ever before. But a lot of things in the industry are not better than they were. The low levels of productivity improvement, lowest cost contracting, very short-term transactional relationships that we see these days. And of course, along with all of that, the reduction in levels of direct employment. I think it is important to emphasize, I agree with the entire report, but I think it is important to recognize that not all clients and employers only care about money. Not all contractors just see people as commodities and expendable. And not all self-employment is bad, a point that Prof. Gospel makes. And not all people are so short-sighted that they can only focus on what they earn next week and not about their futures. And we understand all of that. But I think it is important to sort of make that clear for fear of offending pretty much everyone in the industry if we're not careful. But but behind all of this, we've got some real structural problems, and the ones that we'll recognise: the limited confidence in the future workload, no visible pipeline. I think I've heard that said damn near all of my career. And in the vast majority of cases, a dependence on lowest price contracting, which takes us to a particular place. And of course, tax laws that have made it easy to be, should we say, enterprising. Perhaps that's a polite way of putting it. But the future, really does have to be significantly different from the past. We're facing a very real need to address climate change. Dealing with net zero is not optional. We have an absolute imperative to address the building safety issues that we have. We're entering a fourth industrial revolution where the use of technology is going to accelerate, and we are living in a world where digital capability and modern methods of construction are inevitable and a welcome way forward. You add to this a retiring workforce, a huge challenge of recruitment into the industry, of any age, not just the youngsters, but people in general to this industry. And of course, you throw COVID in on top, and that's where we find ourselves at the moment. But all of this points unavoidably to a huge focus on competence and training and retraining, which in my opinion, and for all the reasons offered by Prof. Gospel's report, simply isn't going to happen, and certainly not fast enough or big enough without more direct employment. That I think for me is a very clear given. Now, probably the most important first step when you've got a problem is to be honest enough to admit that you have indeed got a problem. And again, I think the report is a very important step here. And of course, having admitted you got a problem, the next important step is to accept that you're going to do something about it. And I hope that's the point that we've reached now. And when I say you, I actually mean all of us. This is a problem for every part of the industry. Yes, we're here talking about the electrical sector, but it's I don't see any great difference in any other sector either. So let's go back to some of these underlying causes. Firstly, well, the lack of confidence in future workload. I think it's fantastic to see the publication of the government's construction playbook. It's a massive step forward, and one that we've all got to support and encourage and make happen. There are three key points in this. The first is the need to establish long-term contracting. Portfolio procurement is a term that's described. The government's commitment to publishing and maintaining a visible and real pipeline of future works. These are two vital underliers for me, if you like. And the second really important point that I think comes out in the playbook and in increasingly what many people are saying, the recognition that value and whole life cost should be the basis for contracting and not lowest cost. And when we talk about value, that includes social value in the broadest possible sense. Yes, for the communities that we serve, but also for the people that we employ. And again, the report makes those points very clear. But if we get those two things in place, longer term contracting, confidence in the future, a focus on delivering value and not lowest initial cost, then I think we're in a place where the focus on recruitment and training and upskilling that's essential to doing all the things that we need to do, then I think we're in a different place. So to summarize, we have to rise to the challenges that society is facing. We have to undertake a massive recruitment and training and competence program to be able to do this. In my personal opinion, this is simply not going to happen with the level of direct employment that we currently have. However, we get these other bits right, I think we stand a very good chance. I do think we're at a critical point, and I think we stand a chance of moving to a very different place. I think the time has come. We've talked about levels of direct employment for long enough, but the time has come for action. So I welcome the report. It fits very comfortably, or very well rather, with government announcements about future procurement, and it fits very well with the unavoidable challenges that we have and the needs that we've got to address. So this is a good step, and I wholeheartedly applaud what we're doing and saying here today.
Andy, thank you very much indeed for such a clear and positive response to the report. Okay, let me now turn to Gail Cartmail, Assistant General Secretary, Unite the Union. Been a friend of mine for many years. Gail, be very interested to hear your reflections on the report and its recommendations.
Gail, you're on mute.
Someone had to do it. Sorry, it was me. So I was saying, thanks very much indeed, Brendan and Professor Gospel, and importantly, I think the interviewees from whom you drew much of your findings. One of the points I made in our informal chat earlier is that there is a serious risk of violent agreement among us on this panel, and I think that's been picked up a bit by Andy, which is, you know, the challenge is how do we carry the recommendations forward but bring people with us. One of the points I'd make about skills and needing urgently to scale up apprenticeships and investment in skills is very many people in the senior leadership of construction came via the apprentice route. So not only do we have an issue around, if you will, people on the tools, but we've got an issue also potentially of a skills gap of layers of management. And I think that needs to be understood in the context of the net zero challenge. Of course, I agree that we should strive for better outcomes on health, safety and well-being, and I welcome the Professor's findings on that. Tackling false self-employment, I think, is going to be very tricky. Convincing government of means by which to remove false incentives must go beyond what's already planned, because umbrella companies and payroll companies, entities of that nature, which provide intermediaries, are mercurial. And no sooner do you feel that one's been dealt with and another pops up, such is that we have members paying their apprenticeship levy to umbrella companies. That isn't what government intended. And just to point to the part of the report which I massively welcome, and that is the safeguarding standards. The importance of the electrotechnical certification scheme, the ECS, and the potential for that to be a means by which cardholders can signify direct employment. I think that could be quite a good auditing tool. And, you know, again, of course, I agree with Andy. The construction playbook takeaway for me was consideration of factors beyond price. So we do know we've got some good examples. We know it can be done. We know, for example, in the private sector, we've got a major infrastructure project in the southwest of the country where the client has ensured there's a level playing field for contractors, and embedded in the client's asks are ratios on apprenticeships and skills. And we know there's a major infrastructure project where the client has instigated blind recruitment apprenticeship, and we see increasing numbers of women coming into apprenticeships. So we know that that client appetite to get it right, you know, is there. It's perhaps embryonic, but we know it can be done. What I would say, Brendan, in respect of the public sector, is that it is now time for the public sector at national, regional and local level, across all government departments and entities, to lead by example. Now, Within the JIB, we formulated support for a construction charter within which there are specifications for direct employment and apprenticeships. But to a certain extent, I think it's true to say, Steve would agree, I hope, that would be somewhat hamstrung by an interpretation of the European Union Procurement Directive. Well, if there's ever a time to review procurement practices and add social value, now has to be the time in terms of contracting in construction. And the large contractors, of course, have a role to play in awarding contracts to firms who directly employ their workforce, but importantly enforce greater transparency through their supply chain. And if there's ever a lesson to be learned from Carillion, it was a supply chain out of control, and the casualties, of course, were mum and dad firms and lots of people, including young apprentices. So I think that's my 5 minutes up, Brendan. You'd be giving me the red light, so I'll end it there. You're on mute, Brendan. Touché.
Yes, indeed. I haven't got a red light on this occasion, Gail. An arrangement that worked very well in the TUC with occasionally loquacious sisters and brothers. Gail, of course, was never falling foul of those regulatory arrangements. Okay, now let me ask for comment from Steve, CEO of the ECA. Steve, great to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you, Brendan. I was going to talk about the overlap between the work of the CLC's business model workstream, building on some of the things that we've already said, but going last, of course. I'll try not to overlap with anything and pick up on them, and also conscious that my CLC boss is on the call. I better be very careful what I say. So, but just looking at some of the things that have been said, I think the business models workstream is an opportunity for actually starting to put this report into practice, because personally I think it's a fantastic report and I think it's extremely timely. So let me tell you a little bit about the business models work firstly. Ultimately, it's based on a report that was produced back in 2018, Procuring for Value, a report written by Anne Bentley and fully endorsed by the CLC. And ultimately, it looks to reform procurement to focus on lifetime value, and then reform delivery models to become more collaborative and quality focused. So really resetting the whole framework to create an environment for the things that we've talked about to flourish. And it's not only the CLC that are looking at this. I mean, if you look at the report, it talks about Dame Judith's comment, for instance, on the Grenfell inquiry, where she talks about procurement and the need to change the behaviors in the supply chain, because we can't change things down the other end of the supply chain, you know, in the lower tiers, particularly without changing the broader environment. So we are very much need to set that tone, I think was the words she used. So I just want to have a look at a few opportunities for actual progress taking this report forward. And one we've talked extensively about already, it's the construction playbook, so I won't go too much into detail other than to say there is a future review of the playbook already being talked about, and a list of the things that may feature in that review to be listed. And you'll be pleased, hopefully, to know that the CLC have already flagged that employment and employment practices and how they impact on outcomes has been flagged as a part of that. So there's an opportunity to take this report into that. There's another initiative that will be hopefully launched around springtime. It's called the Value Toolkit. And the Value Toolkit is another attempt to focus on value. So it's to help people at the very early stage of a project to say, what does value over the lifetime of this development actually look like? And break that down into component parts and really analyze it. And again, you'll be pleased to know that they're called capitals. There are 4 capitals, 4 areas of focus. There are 2 in there which are very relevant to this report. There's human capital, people, and employment is in there, for example, and there's social value, as Gail mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to take this learning into there. Another one is, I think it's what Gail was referring to, is the current green paper by the government on the procurement reform. Post EU, obviously the whole thing is up for review. I think all of the parties should be making a submission to that, but you have to get your skates on. It closes in March. And then another one that we're looking at is called fair practices. So this is looking at things like payment, it's looking at contractual clauses, all the things that set that tone we talked about. But we're also looking at retentions. Now, when you look at retentions in isolation, it's a very operational level issue, and the argument is about money. And we're having a debate about how we can support the CLC's stated in, proposal to ban retentions by 2025. So very much looking at that. But actually, the more interesting debate is, why do we have retentions? And we have retentions because we build effective buildings. And we build effective buildings because we have a dysfunctional delivery model and a poor procurement process. So all these things are very much connected. And there's an opportunity again to look at that whole process and look at, you know, why are we focused on low cost and dumping risk? You know, why do we sacrifice on the altar of low cost the good things we've talked about, like quality, like investment in skills, like improved productivity, like improved levels of safety, like improved levels of innovation? All of these things that come about from employment, they don't feature. As the statement in and Howard's report said from the tier 1 contractor, obviously will remain anonymous, the person interviewed said, didn't he? He said, I don't know what goes on down there being anything below tier 1. All I'm interested in is cost and deadlines. Quality, safety, innovation. Yeah, not criticizing, it's the way the whole thing is structured. So there's an opportunity for us to take this report. As I said, it's very timely, and build that in. Just on the broader point to finish off on CLC, there's also a work stream looking at skills. They've also identified the same thing. So we'll be looking to bring those two processes together. So a very strong overlap with this and the work of the CLC, and a big opportunity to work together for a positive outcome. That's it, Brendan. Thank you. You're on mute, Brendan.
Thanks indeed. I'm trying to be a good citizen and turn my microphone off when I'm not speaking. Thanks, Steve. Lots of areas where clearly there's a lot of thinking going on. Let's turn it now into a discussion amongst colleagues. And I wanted to just first of all maybe just go back to Howard. Howard, everybody seems to, and let's hope your sound's working okay. Everybody seems to be very, very supportive of your report, the analysis, and the indication of areas where potentially change could bring real benefits. So what are the obstacles that have to be overcome to take it forward? Not everybody can be an angel in this part of the constellation, perhaps.
Okay. I hope I can be heard this time. I've tried adjusting. Is it any better?
It's okay. It's just about okay, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, just about okay. So obstacles, some are from outside the industry, and these are to do with the framework of employment law that we have in this country, which is rather ambiguous on the role of workers who are dependent contractors, and also those working for umbrella companies. Also external to the industry, the tax situation, which we referred to, has to be one of the major obstacles. In particular, the fact that there is a big incentive for employers to gain the major tax advantages of not employing direct. Within the industry then, I think the obstacles are, they have been gone through by my colleagues, but I think that it is a situation where the industry has become habituated to certain practices and certain ways of working, and it's very difficult to break through that culture. Now, I think there's a role to be played by institutions such as the JIB, but I want to stress the role that clients, major clients can play, and major tier one contractors in terms of knowing what's going on and enforcing different ways of working down through their supply chains, monitoring that and enforcing that.
Thanks, Howard. Andy, Gail talked about the role of clients, potentially setting out conditions in contracts on investment in apprenticeships, the role that public sector clients in particular could play in really driving change in this area. What were your reactions to her thoughts? You know, the role of the construction charter idea, for example, that has been developed as a tool for clients to use to address these issues.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that there's no doubt clients have an important role to play, whether that's government or whether that's entities or whatever. I don't think it matters much, and I think it probably is fair to say that on the larger flagship type projects, it's not uncommon. Olympics, Crossrail, Tideway, we specify levels of apprenticeships as a percentage, levels of people with convictions, local employment, and a whole bunch of other things, and that's fairly normal for those kind of big projects. But I'm not so sure that's normal more generally in the industry for clients, and that could my view is that those clients that do could and should be more demanding, and those that don't should join them. But of course, it is devilishly difficult to find. We have direct employment requirements mentioned in our contracts, but it is devilishly difficult. And I sort of understand I don't know quite what goes on down there. I think from a Tideway point of view, it's not for want of trying, but the creativity of certain companies to have themselves seen in a particular way, it can be quite challenging. And again, I think we do have to recognize, you know, the sort of the tunneling jobs that I've been on recently. These are quite particular resources, and if you haven't got any tunneling, you haven't got any tunneling, and you need to go somewhere else. And a lot of these people travel around the world doing that, so there, as I was saying earlier, and as the report recognizes, some self-employment is not all bad, or some, you know, employment agency work is necessary. But the point is, if as a perpetual client, if you want to see the improvements in capability and competence and quality, addressing Steve's point about retentions, then you've got to be realistic and say there's a much greater chance of seeing that if we've got the right model of employment, and therefore we've got the much higher probability of people being trained in the right way. So there's no doubt clients have a role to play, but that's not the only, as always, there's no single body in this that can solve all of the problems, but there's no doubt clients have to play their role.
You mentioned, Andy, the importance of taking a different approach in terms of recognizing the whole value of projects, the whole life cost, and the social value to be factored in. Do we need new metrics to help in taking that rather different approach? And are there resistances? I mean, I can hear a debate in some parts of government where people would say we need to simplify procurement things. We don't need to add in extra conditions that make it harder for contractors to bid for. It's all making it too complicated. So how do we counter that potential resistance that may come?
Well, I think the simplifying argument is one of the reasons why we've boiled it down to lowest cost, because then, you know, them's numbers, and they're easy, they speak for themselves, and that's not got us anywhere, is it? So it unfortunately, some things can't be that simple. And of course it's devilishly difficult to describe value, and of course value in one context could be something different to value in another, and so yes, it is challenging, and yes, there's a lot of work, as Steve says, on the value toolkit, and trying to understand what value means in the context of this schools program or this hospitals program. And it's okay that they're different. I think what is not okay is that people haven't tried with proper intent to describe what value means. What value can we add through the delivery of whatever it is that's being delivered? And if that's a genuine attempt to do that, then it will consider local employment. It will consider local impact. It bloody well should. But it also will consider the social value that's achieved through the method of employment. And that, if that's done properly and with good intent, then I think we're going to make a big step forward.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Howard, can I bring you in? I'll bring you in before we close, if I may, Howard. But I wanted to ask Gail, if I may, just for reactions on these points. I mean, you talked about the idea of the construction charter and working with some significant public sector bodies in particular, and the opportunities maybe now that we're not bound by the EU procurement directive. Do you sense there's a change of response perhaps coming in this area, Gail, or are you finding it as difficult as it ever has been to get a recognition that maybe actually a longer term kind of approach might deliver better value in the longer term? You're on mute, Gail.
We're playing tag. You know, there's definitely a change in the mood music, Brendan, definitely, and that's to be welcomed. But you know, the challenge is implementation, and some of the people in the questions on chat are raising, you know, really important issues. There's Gary, who's a labour-only supplier at the bottom tier, and he's saying, well, you know what, I have 100% directly employed, but there's going to be undercutters. And so how do we safeguard against undercutting? Well, I think what, don't want to put words in your mouth, Professor Gospel, but I think what Professor Gospel is saying is that both tier 1 clients and public bodies could, as a requirement, have direct employment. Now, my experience with the nice do sections of contracts is, unless they're legally enforceable, the client, which can be a quango, suddenly finds itself unable to fulfill those social obligations because those clauses aren't legally enforceable. And I think that that has been a factor, Brendan. So we need to be really sharp in understanding when we're ensuring or wanting to ensure social values such as direct labour, such as diversity in recruitment, such as upscaling apprenticeship offers and skill offers, that those are enforceable clauses in contracts, whether public or private. And Linda in the chat has raised another important point, which, you know, could be a glitch. She's saying, well, low energy construction, meeting net zero targets in the built environment requires input from further education. And so we need some joined up thinking across government so that we have the wherewithal to support an upsurge in good quality apprenticeships that are fit for the future. And I think, you know, the question you asked is, well, or rather, Andy talked about tunnelling, you know, and legitimate use of self-employed specialists. It's a bit like ship carpet layers. You know, there are particular people that go from one ship to another and lay carpet, but the figure 50%, that has to be what we look at. That has to be a sobering statistic. And we cannot go to 60%. I mean, where to from there? So I think that, you know, we are at the foothills potentially of a very significant change, but you know, I think everybody involved in today's discussion, you know, has to be a party to making that happen, including the 70 odd people who are our audience, because among them are leaders of the industry and educators in the industry, as well as workers in the industry. We've got to do this together, dare I say it, in social dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. Steve, you mentioned the green paper on procurement, and this issue is clearly a big part of this conversation, how procurement is managed. Do you have a sense about the direction that may be taking public policy in?
Yeah, well, I think the idea behind the reform is to give us freedom and flexibility, of course, within reason and for good cause. But I think picking up on some of the things that Gail said, if we want to do these things, we want to set measures in this area, then we have to have the broad legal framework to be able to do so. So I think the green paper is very important in that respect, that we have to give ourselves the leeway without obviously sort of leading to tomorrow's problem. I think then the next step is we have to have the mechanisms to back that up. And I mentioned them earlier on in my presentation. But you know, there's ways to do this. I mean, if you take the current policy in the public sector, for instance, they have presumptions in favor of things, for example. So project bank accounts, if people may be familiar with those, a contentious issue across the industry, but actually there for solid reason to enable fairness in the supply chain. Now, the way the policy works is that they're required to be adopted on a contract unless there are compelling reasons not to be adopted. Fairly reasonable. Its take-up is a little bit mixed, but the principle is solid, and I'm sure it'll be built on over time. Same thing now with offsite. So clearly we want to make a move towards adopting technology and offsite a little more. So there is a presumption in favor there of offsite. It's not, I wouldn't think, beyond our capabilities to come up with a similar arrangement rather, for employment on through procurement processes. But back to your point about the green paper, we've got to give ourselves a flexibility in there. We've got to highlight the point that this issue is a really important one. And I think what Howard's report does is it makes the connection between this issue in isolation and these bigger points, these consequences that arise from it, which I don't think everybody fully understands. And for me, what this does, it's brought that message home in a really clear way at a really good time, and we need to use it.
Excellent, excellent. Colleagues, I think we need to move towards completing this webinar by one. So I wanted to give each of our speakers an opportunity for just any final thoughts or reflections on the debate we've had before we close. So Howard, let me turn to you first for any final thoughts.
Well, I just wanted to say on metrics, which came up earlier, that I think we're looking for major clients and big building firms to set an example. I think there is a case for reporting on forms of employment. We do, after all, have this in areas like modern slavery, gender pay gaps, and social responsibility. I think it's incumbent on the industry to think through certain principles and to have clients and major employers report on what they are doing and what is happening down through their supply chain, and indeed to have those reports audited. We already have that in some parts of the sector, in particular on large oil and petrochemical sites. But I thought I'd just end, if I may. I mean, we haven't talked too much directly about ordinary employees, and I'd like to go back to my research. I've got one nice quote. There was a nice quote that Steve wrote in from a major employer, but one from a worker that I interviewed said, "This has been going on for too long. It really hurts people's lives. Those at the top have tended to turn a blind eye to this, and it's all become habituated. There's a real need to go beyond the talk and really to do something about this."
Okay, a powerful thought, Howard. Andy, let me turn to you for any final thoughts.
Yes, thank you. I think for me, a really big step, as I said, is actually us all recognizing this has to change. I think in the past, perhaps there's been a lot of debate as to, well, is this right? It could be this, could be that, and all sorts of other things. But I think a very clear position for everyone in the industry that we have to shift what's currently going on. We're not saying there must be 100% direct employment. Nobody is saying that. But recognizing that where we are is nowhere near good enough is a really important point. I think we're there. We know there are many things that have to change to allow that to happen. And if the procurement isn't right, then you're not going to have the conditions. As I say, it's encouraging that those things are being addressed. We've got a long way to go to actually make that a reality. And we've all got a role to support that. I think there was a question in the chat just now around why did we not manage to get some of the future skills statements from CLC into the playbook? Well, we couldn't get everything in the playbook first time round. We all recognized that it was issue 1 of the playbook. And as Steve says, we know that there's a number of things that we've got to get in there. But we've all got to push at pull on all the levers that we can pull on. And if we do that across the piece enough times, we will get to a different place.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Gail.
Well, thanks very much, Brendan, for the chance just to make a final comment. I think in the report, Professor Gospel talks about voice, and he's just very well articulated the voice of an individual worker. Well, collectively, our voice is through union, and I would hope to breathe life into this. It is the Joint Industry Board, and I know through the Joint Industry Board, Unite will work with our ECS colleagues on the recommendations and consider them. But I would like to make a wider appeal to the industry. You know, we need and we could benefit from better social dialogue, better engagement with workforce representatives, to transition into a period where there is confidence in direct employment as opposed to short-term financial gain. And the final point I'd make is the issues arising from forced self-employment impact not only on tax revenue, but they impact on national insurance revenue. If there is one thing that this pandemic has taught us, it is you pay in and you get out of our NHS. So an indirect benefit of this, I think, is more money in the coffers of our beloved NHS.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Another very powerful point. Steve.
Thank you, Brendan. I've talked a lot about the wider industry in the earlier bits. I'd just like to finish off, because it would be remiss of me otherwise, to focus on the bits in the report about the electrical industry, given my job. And I think, again, it's an excellent report, and I thank Howard for doing so. And in the routes section of the report, the 4 routes, the first one, of course, is looking more towards our industry. And there's some very important things in there. Gail's alluded to one of them, the ECS. I think he can play a really important point. But he also flags to us the importance of modernizing our agreement. And we've talked about a world that's changing. You know, you look around in the electrical industry, electrification of heat, electrification of transport, the cleaning of energy generation, smart grids, smart cities, digitization. I could go on. It doesn't take a genius to work out the world's going to look a lot different in the not too distant future. So heads up to us, which we need to take on, which is, you know, come back and have a look at the agreement, make sure it's fit for purpose in the future. And we look forward to working with our union colleagues to do this. So thank you for that. Otherwise, I think, as I said earlier, a very, very timely report, and hopefully will help us to paint the importance of this picture to that wider group of stakeholders and get some change. So thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks, Steve, and thanks to all of our panelists today. I think it's been a very rich discussion with whether it's violent agreement, I'm not sure, but a very, very high degree of agreement that this is an area where the benefits of making change would flow very positively to the whole industry, to society more widely, as well as to the workforce, if we could only get this right. Things won't change overnight, but this report hopefully will be a real stimulus to some fresh thinking and engagement by all the key players in thinking through how that change could be delivered. Certainly in the JIB, both Howard and I are both what are called public interest members of the JIB, and we'll be keen to work very actively with the JIB parties, the employers in the industry, and Unite the Union to see what can be changed through the JIB's structures to help take this agenda forward in a positive way. And I know within the JIB there'll be thoughts about whether some further round table events might help keep this dialogue moving in a positive and a practical way. So thanks to all our panelists. Just to say, I think was mentioned right at the outset, a recording of this webinar has been made and it will be available through the JIB's YouTube channel. Hopefully everyone who's been able to listen in has found it of interest and of value. And we'll look forward to taking this conversation forward in other ways. So thanks to everybody and look forward to seeing how this agenda develops over these next periods. Many thanks and goodbye.